Hello, my APUSH children. This is Master Instructor, Chairman General Thorson, the Benevolent Dictator, General or Gryffindor, either works. Today we are going to be learning about Chapter 28, the Affluent Society of the 1950s. And what we will be looking at is, first of all, the social history of it, and then we're going to be talking about Eisenhower. So let's get started. So what are people doing to start celebrating that the war is over? They start to celebrate. They're coming home, and they are demobilizing. We're seeing the army become much less populous. And as you can see over here, people are real excited, and they're going to start making babies soon, and we're going to see the baby boomers come about. And this is just a preview, but I'm not going to get into the gory details. I'm sure you can figure that out. You probably figured that out in health class. And for an example of how we started to demobilize, by 1945 we had 12 million people in the military, and then 2 years later it was down to 1.6 million. And again, demobilization is just the shrinking of the armed forces. Now that we've demobilized, the people coming back from the war, the boys coming back from the war, are looking for some jobs. What are they going to do? So the war industries, we don't need to make products for the war anymore. Now we're going to have to start making peace products, which basically means consumer goods. So they're starting, instead of making tanks and weapons, we're going to see that they're going to start making things like automobiles and televisions and household appliances and cameras. Also during this time, after the war, the wartime pricing and rationing was removed. And what that means is, during the war, they the government was setting prices and setting how much of a certain item people could buy, because they needed to, they couldn't be making as many consumer goods, so they had to really cut down on what people could buy. But now that they said, okay, we're not setting prices anymore, you guys can buy whatever you want, prices skyrocketed for a little bit. We had inflation for a couple of years, and it's because of the fact that there weren't enough consumer goods yet. It's not like overnight you get all these consumer goods. You have to, it takes a little bit of a while to make them. That's my little bit of an economics nerd coming out of me teaching you guys this stuff. There were labor strikes during this time because people want things right away. They want instant gratification, and they weren't getting it. So 5 million people were striking by 1947. But the government stopped it, and they actually, Truman stepped in and said, listen, if you strike, I'm just going to come in there and take over, so you might as well knock it off. And they did. But then the Taft-Hartley Act was passed in 1947, and that said that unions really didn't have the right to strike anymore. Also, we're also seeing women go back home, not only because the boys are home and taking their jobs back in the factories, but they're also going home to make babies.
So here's some examples of some advertising of different products that were being created at the time. You could see a 47 Ford, the refrigerator. Those are coming back now, where it's the refrigerator on top, freezer on the bottom. That's an awesome looking camera with that nice flash on top. We got a vacuum for $49.95. And that television that you see in the top left corner is actually the television that's in my classroom right now. Huh, weird.
All right, here's some more of my economics history nerd coming out of me. Right now we're seeing the economy boom. And this graph is basically showing you what's called the gross national product, which is the value of all goods and services created in the United States in a year. And you can see that pretty much each decade it's almost doubling in size from the 1940s to the 1960s. So we're doing pretty well, especially in the 1950s. We're going to see it kind of go down a little bit again in the 70s. So now we have money that we've been saving during World War II, and now we want to buy stuff with it. So we've become a consumer economy. And let me just give you an idea of how much we are consuming. In the 1950s, the United States was 6% of the population in the world, yet we were consuming half of all products in the world. So you can kind of get an idea of how much of a consumer nation we became.
Hey guys, Miss Thorson here. What are you doing? Get out of here!
Sorry about that, guys. I didn't mean to frighten you. So going back to the PowerPoint, why were the 1950s so prosperous? Well, lots of people had been saving their money during World War II, and they wanted to spend it. So when you're spending money, that's making the economy go around, and businesses do better, and then they can hire more people, so there's more jobs. And there's this huge, what's called pent-up demand, where it's like, I want stuff, and I want it now. And businesses are like, okay, we'll give it to you. Just make sure you pay for it. And all of a sudden, we see new technologies, like the television coming out, and everybody wants one in their home. And by 1960, 98% of homes had televisions in them. Also, the GI Bill was passed, which basically said for every year you serve in the Army or the Armed Forces, you get a year of school. So what did the GI Bill of Rights do? It provided funds and education for veterans. Every year you serve, like I said, you get a year of school, and 2.2 million veterans took advantage of this. And then a total by the end of the 1950s, 7.8 million veterans, or about 50% of the World War II vets, received either training or education under this bill, and it still exists today. The GI Bill not only gave out money for education and training, but it also gave money for home loans to veterans. In 1944, there were 114,000 home loans given out by the GI Bill, but by 1950, 1.7 million loans were given out by the GI Bill. Also, during this time, the overall home ownership had increased by 62% by 1960, which means that more people are owning homes than renting. And usually, typically, if you're owning a home, it's more going to be in suburban areas rather than the urban places, which makes sense because this is the era of suburbia. So what are some of the new jobs going on right now? They're white-collar jobs, big business, financing, advertising, like you've seen on Mad Men in the 1950 show. Other service jobs that we see are in industry, or in insurance, in hospitality, like with McDonald's and Holiday Inns popping up around this time. And we are seeing a shift. Instead of blue-collar jobs being the majority of jobs, it's now white-collar jobs, or working in an office, or clerical service jobs. All right, moving on. We're talking about now why the 50s were so prosperous. What made them so successful when it came to the economy? Basically, businesses were becoming more efficient, and because of their efficiency, they were able to grow bigger. So that's where we get the bigger is better quote. And IBM at the time, which is a computer company, grew by about 10%, or 10 times what they were, excuse me, I said that backwards. And GM doubled its assets up until 1960, so they were doing well, along with IBM and other companies. Also, conglomerates were forming, which are big mergers that consist of 3 or more unrelated companies. Some examples of that would include GE. If you think about anything that GE makes, think about this. They make light bulbs, they make appliances, they make jet engines, they make medical equipment, and they actually own NBC and Universal, which was kind of a bad purchase because NBC doesn't do anything good. And you can also see Berkshire Hathaway, who is run by the richest man in the world, Warren Buffett. And with that, if you are interested in owning any type of stock, you should definitely invest in Berkshire Hathaway stock. I think they're going for about $100,000 a share right now, real cheap, real inexpensive. Also, Time Warner, which used to be AOL, Time Warner is a conglomerate, and Philip Morris is also a conglomerate. They make unrelated products like macaroni and cheese and cigarettes, unless you buy those two together, which you shouldn't because you should never smoke. We're also seeing farms move towards big corporations rather than being small farms where, you know, a lot of people own a little bit of land. We see fewer people owning a lot of land, and it's in a new type of business called agribusiness. Why? Because it's more efficient to have bigger farms and less people. There's new technology that makes it easier for one person or a small group of people to plow a larger amount of land. And because of pesticides being created during this time, it meant that more crops were growing for a lot longer. So how did it change? Well, farm sizes doubles from the 1940 and 1960s. So the size of a farm actually doubled, meaning like if there was a 500-acre farm, it turned into 1,000. But the number of farmers decreased because of that. It went from 6 million to 4 million farmers, and today's day and age, there's only 2.3 million farmers. So you can see that there's less farmers that have bigger lots of land. And the farming population in total went down from 30 million to 13 million. Now that the war is over, people are moving. They realize that they don't want to stay up north anymore where it's freezing cold all the time in the winter. They want to go somewhere where it's warm constantly. So they move from what's called the Rust Belt. Isn't that a lovely name? Guess what? We're part of it. That includes basically the Midwest, Ohio, us, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, to the Sun Belt, which includes California, Arizona, Texas, and Florida. They're moving to warmer places. There's more jobs there, And of course, the weather is just a tad bit nicer than it is up north. What else is making them able to do this? The automobile culture. Everybody's got a car, but not only that, because Eisenhower building the highway system, with the Highway Act of 1956, we see more people driving. Anytime you see, you know, I-55, I-88, I-39, I-80, that's because of Eisenhower. He spent $32 billion to make 40,000 miles of road. And that's why certain roads up in Chicago are named after him, if you've ever been on them. Speaking of Eisenhower, like I said, he was a president during this time, and this is what we're going to talk about next. We're going to talk about Eisenhower's presidency from 1953 until 1961. So let's get started. So in 1952, Eisenhower runs for president. Truman decides not to anymore, and eventually we're going to find out with the 22nd Amendment, presidents aren't allowed for more than to run for 2 terms. So the country's ready for a change. They've had a Democrat in office of president since 1932 for a good solid 20 years. And they're kind of sick of the Democrats. So they vote in Eisenhower. And everybody loves Eisenhower. He's a war hero. He's a pretty level-headed, kind of low-key guy. And he's running actually against Adlai Stevenson from Illinois, who is a Democrat, who will run again for president and lose again for the presidency. So Eisenhower wins by a landslide. Everybody loves him. They want to change. They don't want the Democrats in office anymore. So what does he do with his time in office? We're going to find out. So one of Truman's mottos was the buck stops here, and now we're seeing Eisenhower, one of his mottos being more bang for your buck. And this is where we get the idea of massive retaliation. He felt that the key to the Cold War victory would to have a strong military and economy. It wasn't just the military, we had to have a good economy too. But we had to show the world that a free enterprise is much better than communism. It's quite simple, really. If we're having a great economy, we are very prosperous in the 1950s, people are going to want to be like us. They see us and they're like, wow, it looks great over there. Everyone has a TV, everyone has a car. I want to be like them. And so that's how he set up the economy. And it actually worked out pretty well. But again, you need to remember, we're not going to get out of this war for a few decades. We're not going to get out until the 90s. But here's what he did for the military. Think about massive retaliation. His Secretary of State, John Dulles, is the one that came up with this idea, where instead of having a gigantic, huge standing army just waiting around to fight, let's just build a huge arsenal of nuclear weapons to have behind our back. Again, remember what TR said, speak softly and carry a big stick. This will take you far. Our big stick was the 18,000 nuclear weapons that we had in our arsenal that we would threaten anybody with if they decided to mess with us or mess with any of our friends. So what was Eisenhower's and Dulles's basically rationale for wanting to use massive retaliation, which again was the idea of having a large nuclear arsenal, which, as you can see below, that they had 1,000 in their artillery, and now we have 18,000 nuclear weapons in our arsenal. So the reason behind it, Eisenhower said, listen, we can't win the Cold War by fighting a bunch of small wars. And of course, right there, he was referring to the Korean War. He felt that if we're going to do this, we got to go out, we got to go big. Now, another thing you can see is that Eisenhower cut spending from $50 billion in the military to $34 billion. That is a very large cut. And a lot of people were surprised by that because he's a military guy. But remember what I told you before. We have to have a strong military and a strong economy. In the eyes of a Republican, a strong economy means budget cuts, even if it's to the military. So here comes the Sputnik Crisis. I need to give you some background information first of why it is such a crisis. When we had our nuclear weapons, how are we going to actually get them to our targets? Well, we were using B-52 bombers, airplanes, that could drop the bomb on any place in the world. But what is the problem with that? Those bombers can be shot down by anybody in any country. So if the USSR saw us come with a bomb, they could see it and shoot down our planes, and then we would have a problem. Well, here's where the Sputnik crisis comes into play. Sputnik was the first satellite launched into outer space that could position missiles anywhere and send a signal to missiles anywhere to be sent anywhere else. And that's why we had a little bit of a problem, because we can't shoot that thing down out of outer space. We don't have anything like that. We're going to see Reagan try to make something like that, and it's not going to work. But these intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, are something that we have to worry about because they can just be launched from the USSR to any continent, us basically, in the world, and there's nothing we can do about it. So we had a little panic attack because not only do they have that type of technology, we didn't yet, and we needed to do something about it. So what was our response? How did we react to when we found out that Sputnik was launched into outer space? It made us realize that we were falling behind the Soviets and we had to catch up to them. So this is when we see the creation of NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, which doesn't exist anymore today. President Obama actually just recently cut it. We also created the National Defense for Education Act, which basically gave more money to education in areas like math, science, and foreign languages. We felt like if we were more equipped in those, that we would be able to catch up to the Soviets. So people who criticized Eisenhower's massive retaliation policy, Eisenhower and Dulles' massive retaliation policy, called it brinkmanship because they felt like Eisenhower was putting us onto the brink of war, and they argued that it was too dangerous because if someone called our bluff, we're actually going to have to send those nuclear weapons somewhere else, and it's going to start another world war, one that's far deadlier than what we just went through in the past 40 years. When Eisenhower ran for president in 1952, he promised that he would end the Korean War. People were sick of it. They wanted to get out of it. So he said he would. And why did he feel like we should end the Korean War? Being a military guy, he looked at it from that standpoint, is that we were losing too many lives and not having enough victories. So he calls up China, he calls up Mao Zedong and is like, listen, we might continue this war, but it's going to be to our own choosing, which basically, if you're reading between the lines, was his massive retaliation plan of saying, if you don't stop helping North Korea, we might just bomb them with nuclear weapons and probably you too. So the war did end in armistice, which is just an agreed ceasefire. So the threat of nuclear war was enough to stop the Chinese from helping out the North Koreans anymore and to stop the North Koreans from fighting anymore. So once the war was over, they had to decide what to do with Korea. So they drew the line at the 38th parallel to divide a North Korea and a separate South Korea as two separate countries. That line, the 30th parallel, is known as the DMZ or demilitarized zone to separate them. There was no victory, but it wasn't a loss for us either. Our goal was to contain communism with this war, and we kept it from spreading to the south. So technically, if we look at it from that standpoint, we met our goal. Like I was talking about before, China fell to communism, and we needed to worry about what to do with the country. And actually, there came a crisis, the Taiwan Crisis, a little island off the coast of mainland China, where the nationalists fled after the civil war that the communists won. Well, the communists were threatening to take over Taiwan. They felt it was part of their country and that the nationals shouldn't be there. So Eisenhower warned the communists that if they were to take Taiwan, that they should expect nuclear war, and that made the communists back off of Eisenhower and the Taiwanese. Another crisis that Eisenhower had to deal with was the Suez Crisis. The Suez is an area in Egypt. We were also afraid at the time that we were going to see a lot of Arab countries fall to communism and befriend the Soviet Union. So what we did, we threw money at it again, like we did under Truman with the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. We tried to offer money to Egypt to help them build a dam across the Nile River. But then all of a sudden we found out that Egypt was starting to buy weapons from Czechoslovakia, who was communist. So we withdrew our offer, and many Arab countries went to support the communists. And we're going to see that one country in particular that decided to fight the communists, we did support, and it's going to be pretty ironic because we're going to start our longest war we've ever fought in American history with them in the 2000s, and that's Afghanistan. Another way that Eisenhower tried to contain communism was through covert operations through the CIA. He had different countries that he was afraid that were going to fall to communism looked after, and basically the CIA planted certain operations in these countries to either stop communism from spreading or overthrow certain regimes that were pro-communist regimes. And they would provide with financial aid, but other times they would actually try to overthrow any anti-American leaders in this country. One of the greatest examples was Kermit Roosevelt, who was a leader of the CIA, actually Teddy Roosevelt's grandson, who was infiltrating the government in Iran, and he helped to overthrow Mossadegh, who was the leader at the time. And he was very popular with the Iranians, and they put in his place the Shah, which is like a king in Iranian government. And the Iranians hated us for it, and that's pretty much why Iran doesn't like us to this day, was because we helped overthrow a very popular leader and put into place a dictator. So guess what, everyone? Joseph Stalin is dead. Yay! And who is the new leader? It's Nikita Khrushchev, and he's not much better than Stalin. A little bit more moderate. He was the guy that had the secret meeting with their Duma, which is just their version of Congress, and told everybody how awful Stalin was and how he didn't want to go with his ways, but he still wasn't that great. Don't get me wrong. Don't think he's that wonderful. He's just the lesser of two evils between him and Stalin. For example, Khrushchev has been quoted as saying, "We will bury capitalism, your grandchildren will live under communism." So you could pretty much have an idea of how he feels about capitalism and what the United States wants. Well, in 1960, Eisenhower and Khrushchev were supposed to meet in Paris at a summit, but things didn't go quite as they wanted. And if you look down at the picture below, you will see that that's Eisenhower and Khrushchev meeting, but they didn't actually have the summit. Okay, so why did the summit not happen? Well, when it came to spying on each other, we were supposed to make an agreement with the Soviet Union that we would not send planes over to spy on each other's property. Well, we still did anyway. We sent a U-2 airplane to fly over the Soviet Union. It got shot down. The Soviets produced the pilot to prove that they had shot it down, so that that's why they pretty much kept him alive, to say that, hey, we actually found this guy, we know he's yours. And Khrushchev said to Eisenhower, you need to apologize for this, and Eisenhower refused to do it. So it really ticked off Khrushchev, and it just made tensions even worsen even further for the years to come. So that's it for chapter 28, and I hope you have a nice night with many sweet dreams.